Hello, my name is Jazu, and throughout my life, I've experienced a series of strange and unsettling events that I'd like to share with you. The girl in the doorway. When I was in third grade, my grandfather had just finished building, painting, and laying carpet in my new room. Since the paint was still drying, I was sleeping on a pallet in my grandparents' room. To set the stage, I was an only child, and no one else lived with us at the time. It was around 8 p.m. on a stormy night, and I was struggling to fall asleep, tossing and turning. I suddenly noticed a figure in the doorway out of the corner of my eye. When I focused, I froze in terror. Standing there was a little girl dressed in period clothing. She appeared to be 6 or 7, with ringlet curls, ribbons, lacy socks, a frilly dress, and dress shoes. Her face was gloomy, and she stood utterly still, staring at me. She was almost transparent, with a faint blue glow outlining her silhouette. Paralyzed by fear, I finally broke free of my trance, covered my face, and counted to 10. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. The pack of dogs. Years later, when I was 11, we lived on a secluded dirt road about 30 minutes from the nearest town. We only had 2 neighbors, neither of whom owned pets. One night, I was awakened by the sound of my dog barking. Irritated, I got up to see what she was barking at. Peering out my window, I was met with a sight I still cannot explain. 12 dogs of varying breeds and sizes sat in a triangle formation in the middle of our yard, staring at my pacing barking dog. When she stopped barking, they would bark one at a time, almost as if they were communicating. The eerie coordination sent chills down my spine. I watched in disbelief, frozen in fear, before eventually lying back down, unable to comprehend what I'd seen. A mysterious visitor. Around 2012, during one of my weekly sleepovers with a friend, we stayed up late sharing ghost stories. It was around 3 a.m., and we were whispering to avoid waking my grandfather, who had to work early the next morning. Suddenly, he burst into my room. Furious, he scolded us, claiming he had seen us outside under the porch light. We were baffled. We had not left the bedroom all night. Despite our protests, he was adamant. To this day, I can't explain who or what he saw that night. The floating light. A few months later, I was outside playing with my younger cousin near my grandparents' trailer. As dusk settled in, we noticed something strange above one of the sheds in the yard. Hovering silently was an object that resembled the gravitron ride from the fair. Lights circled its surface and beams of light shot skyward. The most unsettling part? It was completely silent. My cousin and I stared in awe before I ran inside to fetch my grandparents. By the time we returned, it was gone. My cousin couldn't explain what he'd seen either, and we never saw anything like it again. The haunted house. In 2016, I stayed at a friend's house, an old brick home built in the 1800s that her father was renovating. He had brought in old artifacts such as photographs, letters, and even windows found in abandoned mines and homes. We believe these items may have been the source of the strange occurrences. One day, while cleaning, my friend thought she saw me in the bathroom. She even heard me reply to her in an annoyed tone. The problem? I was in the living room with headphones on, completely unaware of what was happening. Later, she described seeing a translucent, furry figure with insect-like eyes floating down the hallway. That night, things escalated. As we lay in bed, we felt the weight of something crawling up the mattress. Closet doors creaked open, and a foul stench filled the room. My friend began speaking in a childlike voice, saying, "It'll be over soon. He's here." The bed began to shake violently, and I felt knocking beneath it. Too terrified to move, I lay there until everything abruptly stopped. When my friend returned to normal, she had no memory of what had happened. Dorm room terror years later, in college, I moved into a dorm with 2 roommates. From the first week, strange things began happening. Objects moved on their own, lights flickered, and shadowy figures appeared in reflections. One of my roommates, Amanda, experienced the most intense activity. She heard footsteps pacing outside her room at night and voices whispering her name. We all began seeing the reflection of a man in windows and mirrors, a figure that disappeared when we turned to look. The presence in Amanda's room became so oppressive that she started sleeping in the living room. One night, as we decorated for Christmas, I saw the man sitting on the couch, watching us. When I turned back, he was gone. These are just a few of the unsettling events I've experienced. Whether they were ghosts, demons, or something else entirely, I've never found answers. Have you had similar experiences? If so, I'd love to hear your stories. Story 2. Unwelcome Guest, the Haunting of Our Dorm. The story I'm about to share involves myself and 2 roommates. It all began last September when we moved into our dorm. At first, everything seemed normal, but it didn't take long for strange occurrences to start. The first incident happened to Amanda while she was unpacking. She checked all the drawers in her desk and found them empty. A few moments later, she opened one of the drawers to store her belongings and discovered a small Hot Wheels car sitting squarely in the middle. No one else had entered the room, and she hadn't left it. It was impossible for her to have missed something so specific earlier. From there, things escalated. A few days later, the light outside Amanda's room began flickering. We reported it to building staff, and they replaced the bulb. But the flickering persisted. Maybe faulty wiring, we thought. Then Amanda began hearing what sounded like pacing in her room. At first, she assumed it was noise from the hallway, but the sound always seemed to come from inside her room. One day, Amanda walked in and saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of her room. Terrified, she thought someone had broken in. She flipped the light on, but the figure was gone. Last week, Amanda texted me while we were in our respective rooms. Her message read, "Is my boyfriend over?" I replied no. It was the middle of a weekday. Amanda responded, "I just heard a man call my name." She checked the hallway and found it empty. When I joined her to search the dorm, no one was there. Another time, I heard footsteps coming from Amanda's room while she wasn't home. Again, the hallway was silent and empty when I checked. The breaking point for me came last weekend. I was alone in the dorm around 10 p.m. As I came out of the bathroom, I noticed Amanda's bedroom light was on. Thinking she might have left it on by mistake, I tried the door, but it was locked. Later, Amanda told me not only had she turned the light off before leaving for the weekend, but it was off when she returned. Whenever I enter Amanda's room, I feel a heavy, oppressive pressure on my chest. Recently, Amanda smelled cigarette smoke in our smoke-free building. I faintly smelled it too, though none of our other roommates could. Other unexplainable events include the front door locking itself while I walked my boyfriend out for just a couple of minutes. No one was home at the time, yet the door was locked when I returned. Shadow figures have become a regular occurrence. Amanda has seen them in her closet. Once, we both saw the reflection of a man in the window. Amanda described him as an older man, wearing a plaid shirt and jeans. Another time, Amanda felt someone standing behind her while she was in the kitchen. When she turned around, she saw the same man, clear as day, before he disappeared. The pressure I initially felt in Amanda's room has spread to other parts of the dome. I've got movement in reflective surfaces. Once, while decorating our Christmas tree, I saw the man's reflection in the window. He appeared to be sitting on the couch, watching us. When I turned to look, the couch was empty. Amanda once stayed in Teresa's room for the night. She was kept awake by tapping on the walls, noises from the closet, and the sensation of the bed physically moving. Teresa confirmed she felt the bed shift but noticed nothing else. Recently, while alone, I heard a drawer opening in Amanda's locked room. Later, I heard metal hangers clinking in her closet. As I texted Amanda about it, the flickering hallway light, which I had turned off earlier, suddenly switched on by itself. We've nicknamed the spirit Henry, but things are becoming unbearable. We're seeking advice on how to handle this situation. Saging isn't an option, so if there's another way to address this spirit, or whatever it is, we're open to suggestions. Story 3. I lived in a 2-bedroom apartment upstairs, and while I wouldn't necessarily call it a hotspot for paranormal activity, strange things started happening shortly after we moved in. For some reason, my dad's room always made me feel uneasy. Now, I'm not someone who's afraid of the dark, but whenever I walked past his room, when he wasn't home and the door was open, I had this overwhelming sense that someone was watching me from the darkness inside. I began closing his door whenever he wasn't around because the feeling of being watched was too intense to ignore. One day, I came home from school and noticed that my dad's Jeep wasn't in the parking lot. I assumed he was out doing some handiwork for someone, so I went inside, dropped off my backpack, and headed straight for his room to shut the door. As I settled into my room, I suddenly heard heavy stomping noises coming from my dad's room. My heart stopped. My dad always wore these bulky steel-toe boots, perfect for his outdoor work as a carpenter, and these steps sounded exactly like his. I froze for a moment, listened carefully, and then slowly approached his door. I could see light shining from the crack at the bottom of the door. I called out, "Dad?" just to be sure, but received no answer. I hadn't seen his car outside, and when I'd first gone to close the door, the light wasn't on. Maybe I was losing my mind, but the heavy steps continued. My next thought was, what if someone broke in and is hiding in his room? Panicking, I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and crept back toward the door. I stood there, bracing myself for what felt like forever, before finally jerking the door open. But there was no one. No one at all. I ran into his closet, knife still in hand, but found nothing. At this point, I began to wonder if I was just losing it. But the footsteps continued, faint but there. Then, one week, while my dad worked the midnight to 8 a.m. graveyard shift as a security officer, I was in the living room watching TV when I heard the doorknob to the front door jiggle. I froze, my eyes locked on the door, watching the knob turn back and forth for a full minute before suddenly stopping. I rushed to check the peephole, but there was no one there. After that, I started sleeping with the lights on and kept a weapon close by. The next morning, when my dad came home, he looked concerned. He said, "I think someone tried to break in." He took me outside, and I saw scratch marks and wood chipped away from the door frame around the knob. We decided it was probably a junkie trying to break in. This was a neighborhood known for drug use and poverty, but it still freaked us out. My dad began texting and calling more often during his night shifts to check on me. One night, everything seemed calm. No footsteps, no strange feelings in the apartment. I texted my dad that everything was fine and was about to go to sleep since I had to get up early for school. I woke up around 6:30 a.m., still tired, and decided to lay back down and scroll through my phone for a while. As I was lying in bed, I heard the front door unlock. My dad usually got off work around 8 a.m., but sometimes he would come home early. "Dad?" I called out, but there was no answer. Then I heard a grunting sound, like the kind you make when you stub your toe or hurt yourself. It sounded like my dad, but much deeper, almost painful. "Dad, are you okay?" I called out again, but again, no response. The groaning continued, becoming louder, followed by a dragging sound across the carpet. I thought maybe he had hurt his foot or leg, so I listened carefully. The dragging continued, moving from the living room to the kitchen. And then I heard the fridge open and shut. "Dad?" I called once more, but there was still no reply. By now, the groaning had turned into a low, guttural growl, almost like an animal. The sound sent a chill down my spine, and the growl quickly turned into a snarl, an angry, menacing sound that made my blood run cold. The growling came closer, approaching the doorway to my room. It was so loud that I could feel the fury behind it. Then I heard a gust of wind, and the light bulb above me blew out, plunging the room into darkness. It became instantly cold, and I felt a surge of panic. I was paralyzed, frozen in fear. Without thinking, I leapt out of bed to confront whatever it was. But when I opened my eyes, there was nothing there, except for a gallon of water sitting in the middle of the floor. I hadn't seen it there when I went to the bathroom earlier. I didn't stop to question it. In sheer panic, I ran out of my room, checked the living room, no one there, and saw that the front door was locked. I unlocked it and ran down the stairs, crying, before calling my dad. When he arrived, he thought I'd had a bad dream, but I knew what I'd heard, what I'd felt. We moved out soon after, because I couldn't bear to stay there anymore. Whatever it was, it didn't seem like a trapped spirit. It felt malevolent. I never had another experience like it, before or after. I believe it was a demon that had been mimicking my dad's presence. Why that apartment? Why did it mimic my dad? I still don't know. All I know is that it didn't follow me when we moved, but I'll never forget the sound of it growling at me. Story 4. Let me start by saying that I've always been skeptical about the afterlife. I'm the kind of person who needs to see something to believe it. However, my parents told me that when I was very young, I used to see ghosts. Apparently, I got so frightened that one day I asked all the ghosts to leave me alone, and surprisingly, they did. I don't remember any of this, so I always assumed I just had an overactive imagination. For years, I experienced nothing. That is, until I turned 30 last year. About 6 months into the year, something changed. One night I couldn't sleep. I was lying awake in bed, restless, and decided to get up and walk around the house. As I wandered, I suddenly felt that unmistakable sensation, like someone was standing right behind me. The feeling was so strong that I instinctively thought it must be my roommate. I even felt the floorboards shift slightly, as if someone was moving, I turned around, fully expecting to see them, but it wasn't my roommate. Instead, I saw a shadow shaped like a person. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was a distinct figure, a silhouette of pure darkness. They were about a foot shorter than me and appeared to be large in weight. I just stood there, dumbfounded. I managed to mutter, "Oh my God." The figure seemed to pause, almost as if it acknowledged me. Then it began to move, walking around me. I turned to follow its movements, watching as it headed toward the stove. When it reached the stove, it vanished, disappearing into thin air. I couldn't believe it. After all these years of skepticism, I finally had undeniable proof. Ghosts are real. Maybe the afterlife is real too. What's surprising is that I wasn't scared. In fact, I felt a strange excitement. I wanted to see more of them, to understand what I'd experienced. I even hoped the shadow might return. Maybe I'm just a bit of a weirdo. I've never been afraid of the dark or the unknown like most people. I can't help but wonder if this means I have some sort of latent ability, like being a medium. Does anyone have tips on how to explore and strengthen these abilities? Has anyone else seen figures like this? Do they look like shadow people to you? I'd love to hear your experiences or advice if you're willing to share. Here's another story. I was about 5 years old in 2012, on holiday with my mom and dad. We were staying in a hotel with decor that screamed early 2000s. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night. The room was pitch black, and I felt scared. Wanting to get to my mom's bed, I sat up and stood. That's when I saw it, a white face, floating a little distance away from me. Its features were distinct, dark, empty eye sockets with small white pupils in the center, a small nose, and a mouth. I thought it was my mom's face, so I began walking toward it, calling out to her. Then the bedside lamp turned on. My mom was on the opposite side of the room, still in bed. I froze. When I looked back to where the face had been, it was gone. My mom asked what I was doing, but I didn't know what to say. I was too confused. She tucked me back into bed, and I fell asleep within minutes. The next morning, I woke up still unsure about what I had seen. When I told my mom, she brushed it off, saying it was probably just my imagination. But I know what I saw. Unfortunately, neither of my parents remembers which hotel we stayed in, so I can't look up its history or reviews. I'm left wondering, what kind of apparition did I see? Story 5. When I was about 6 years old, I'm convinced I had an encounter with a ghost in my own house. It started one evening while I was watching TV in the living room. I was lounging on the couch when I noticed our old rocking chair moving back and forth on its own. It was odd. The windows were open, but there was no breeze strong enough to make the chair rock like that. Since it was a cool night during the fall, we weren't using the air conditioner either. I chalked it up to the chair, just being old and unsteady. A minute later, it stopped rocking and didn't move again. The next evening, I was watching TV again when I heard something fall in the kitchen. I turned to see a cup lying on the floor, knocked off the shelf. My first thought was that maybe there was a draft, but it didn't make much sense. Curious, I walked over to the kitchen, picked the cup up, and placed it back on the shelf. Nothing else happened that night, and I managed to convince myself it was nothing unusual. But 2 nights later, something happened that I couldn't explain away. I was back on the couch, watching TV, when suddenly, the radio on the desk next to the television turned on by itself. this wasn't like the rocking chair or the cup. The radio could only be turned on manually. There was no way it could have just started playing on its own. I froze for a moment, staring at the radio, before panic took over. Tears started streaming down my face as I bolted to my parents' bedroom. When I got there, my mom was on the phone. She paused her conversation, noticing how distressed I was, and asked what was wrong. Through sobs, I explained that the radio had turned on by itself and that I thought it was a ghost. My mom sighed, clearly unimpressed, and said, "Come on, I'll show you." She walked with me back to the living room, but when we got there, the radio was off. It was as if nothing had ever happened. She looked at me and said, "See? There's no such thing as ghosts." I tried to tell her I wasn't making it up, but she didn't believe me. She went back to her room and resumed her phone call, leaving me alone in the living room. I was too terrified to stay there for long after that night. Although nothing strange ever happened again, that experience stuck with me. For a while, I avoided the living room as much as possible, but eventually, I got over my fear. Still, I firmly believe that I encountered a ghost in our house when I was a child. Here's another story. One time, I saw a ghost, but I was so hungry, I just walked right through it. This happened while I was cleaning up the hallway in my house. I was almost done and had just one last pile of dust to sweep up. Once I finished, I planned to head straight to the kitchen for something to eat. As I looked up, I noticed a tall, black, semi-transparent figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was about 6 feet tall and stood just a couple of feet away from me, blocking the way to the stairs. For a moment, I froze, staring at it. But then my hunger got the better of me. I thought, well, screw it, I'm starving. Without hesitation, I walked right through the ghost, pretending I hadn't seen it. I quickly made my way downstairs, emptied the dustpan, and grabbed some food from the fridge. As I sat eating, I realized how much scarier it would have been if I hadn't been so focused on getting to the kitchen. Looking back, I'm surprised I wasn't more freaked out. But I guess hunger really does make you brave or reckless. Story 6. This is the story of how I became a true believer in the paranormal. In my late teens and early 20s, I worked in a small floral shop. The shop was housed in a charming old one-story building with an attic. It had been converted from a house, and the atmosphere was cozy but slightly eerie. The team was small, and I got along well with my co-workers, who were women in their mid-50s. One afternoon, I was alone in the shop, walking through the retail area toward the front display cooler. The retail area was set up with a couch, an armchair, and a coffee table for bridal consultations. As I was heading back from the cooler and turning toward the seating area, I saw him. He was an elderly man with a head full of white hair, wearing a dark suit, sitting calmly in the armchair. I froze for a moment, startled. But when I turned to face him directly, he was gone. The chair was empty. I felt unsettled, but strangely compelled to keep my composure. For some reason, reacting felt wrong. I brushed it off and went back to work, doing my best to push the experience out of my mind. Over the next few months, I kept seeing him. It was always the same. He would appear in that armchair when I was alone in the shop. And when I looked directly at him, he would vanish. It wasn't constant, but it happened enough to start feeling oddly familiar. One day, curiosity got the better of me. I brought it up to my boss casually, trying to gauge her reaction. "Have you ever felt or seen anything strange in the shop?" I asked. Her eyes widened immediately, and she replied, "Not the man in the chair." That moment was my confirmation. It wasn't just me. He was real, or as real as something paranormal could be. After that, I stopped questioning it. When I saw him, I would simply acknowledge him with a nod or a quick glance, as though he were just another part of the shop. It became no big deal. One Saturday afternoon, though, everything changed. I was alone again, washing buckets in the utility sink. A weekly chore in any flower shop. The utility room was a cramped space, as it had once been a laundry room in the old house. I turned to grab another bucket from the stack behind me and froze. He was there, standing just 2 feet away, right beside the buckets. This wasn't like before. He wasn't sitting quietly in the armchair. He was right there. I jumped in shock, dropping the bucket I had in my hands. My heart raced as I stared at the spot where he stood. For a moment, I was terrified, but then something shifted in me. I composed myself, turned off the sink, and did something I've regretted ever since. I yelled at him. I raised my voice and said, "You cannot do that. You can't just creep up behind me like that." The room felt heavy and silent after my outburst. After that day, I never saw him again. I still wonder about him. Was he tied to the shop somehow? Did I scare him away for good? I don't know, but I do know this. He was real. And because of him, I've never doubted the existence of the paranormal again. Story 7. I'm 50 now, but this experience happened when I was just 8 years old. My dad and I had just come back from 7-Eleven, and he'd bought me a big gulp. For those unfamiliar, a big gulp is massive, like a 2-liter bottle of soda in a giant cup. As we walked through the back door, I tripped, and the cup hit the floor, spilling everywhere. My dad was furious. He beat the ever-loving crap out of me and sent me to bed without dinner. Later that night, lying in bed, I cried myself to sleep. Sometime during the night, I woke up with a strange feeling. Pulling the covers down from over my head, I saw her. A woman in a white dress standing at the foot of my bed. She wasn't solid. I could see through her and even make out the outline of my bedroom door behind her. Frozen in fear, I slowly pulled the covers back over my head. Before anyone suggests it might have been my mom, she was murdered when I was just 16 months old. Maybe it was her spirit trying to comfort me. I'll never know for sure. At the time, it scared me beyond words, but strangely, it also gave me a deep sense of comfort. The moment that truly cemented my belief in the paranormal, though, happened years later when I was stationed in Okinawa. One Saturday, my roommate and I were hanging out in our barracks room watching Game of Thrones. The room was small, with our desks acting as a divider between the beds. His desk chair sat empty at the time. Out of nowhere, the chair began rocking and swiveling on its own. At first, I didn't notice because I was glued to my phone. But then my roommate snapped at me. "Quit messing with me. It's not funny." Confused, I looked up, and that's when I saw it. The chair was moving all by itself. I jumped up, thinking he must have rigged something as a prank. But no, he was pressed against the wall on his bed, looking just as terrified as I felt. The chair continued to rock and swivel for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a couple of minutes. When it finally stopped, we both bolted out of there and headed straight for a stiff drink. Weird things like that happened often during my 2 years in those barracks. Considering Okinawa's history as a major battlefield, especially during World War II's Battle of Okinawa, the bloodiest in the Pacific. It's impossible to say how many lives were lost on the island. One of our guys even found human bones while exploring a small section of jungle near the barracks. The eerie experiences were so frequent, it was hard to keep track of them all. One night, a different roommate woke up to see a shadowy figure standing over my bed. He told me later that he'd heard me choking during a sleep apnea episode while the figure loomed nearby. Sleep paralysis also became a regular occurrence for me while I was there. It happened almost weekly, even though I'd never experienced it before, and haven't since I left. Okinawa changed my perception of the paranormal forever. The island's tragic history seems to have left behind a lingering presence, and I'll never forget those haunting experiences. Story 8. I've always considered myself a pretty level-headed person. I'm an aspiring artist, and I recently published my first story in a small magazine. But not too long ago, I went through a rough patch, a mental breakdown really. It's been 3 weeks since I came back from the mental hospital. While I was there, I told the doctors about some of the strange experiences I've had. I mentioned how I've hit my head and knocked myself out 4 times in my life, and even lost an entire day. One I have absolutely no memory of. I've never experienced anything like that since. But it got me thinking about the bizarre events that have marked my life. One of those memories stood out. The boy who haunted my bedroom when I was 4 years old. I also used to talk to a man during the day, something my mom vividly remembers. I've wanted to share these stories for a long time and see if anyone else has experienced anything similar, or might have some insight. Let me start with the first story. This happened when I was 4 years old, back in 2001. I grew up in rural Montana, in the middle of nowhere, between Polson and Ronan. The land was beautiful, but I hated the house. One of my earliest memories is of the window seat in my room. It had this weird, carpeted perch beneath the window that I loved to sit on during the day, but at night, I dreaded sleeping there. My first memory of that place wasn't a good one. The window seat was covered in multicolored spider eggs. Thousands of them, but the real terror came at night. That's when he would visit. He was a boy, about my height, but his figure was no more than the thinnest outline of a human body. Inside that outline, he was filled with something that looked like TV static. I hated the way he moved around my bed, laughing, and the thing he called a smile. It was all wrong. I'd hide under the blankets, peeking out now and then, hoping he'd go away. But he never did, not until morning. My mom later told me that during the day I'd talked to a man. She remembers it vividly. One time, she was in the kitchen when I came around the corner and froze, pointing to something behind her. "Just stay there," I told her, my voice serious. She said I would often chatter to this man when no one else was around. But at night, it was a different story. At night, all she ever heard was me crying about the boy in my room. It wasn't until we moved out of that house that she learned the truth. Someone had taken their own life in that very room. Story 9. My family owns a large farmhouse in West Virginia, a sprawling place with 25 bedrooms. It's been in our family since 1968 and was eventually converted into a family retreat, perfect for hosting our massive clan of 160 cousins. Despite all the love and memories tied to the house, there's always been something about it that gives me the creeps. No matter how bright the day or how full the house, certain parts of the farmhouse always leave me with an uneasy feeling, like someone or something is watching. One night, that unease became something much more tangible. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. Instinctively, my eyes darted to the far corner of the room near the foot of the bed. And there she was, a little girl. She stood there silently, holding what looked like a teddy bear, dressed in overalls. At first, I thought I must be dreaming. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, fully expecting the apparition to vanish. But when I squinted into the dim light, she was still there. My heart began to pound. I reached out, elbowing my wife, trying to wake her. "What?" she mumbled, groggy and annoyed. I whispered urgently, "Look at the corner. Do you see her?" She froze. Then, without even glancing toward the corner, she said, I sit up and see a little girl. We're leaving this house right now." That was all I needed to hear. I told her to go back to sleep as I forced myself to move, inching across the mattress toward the light switch. My hands were shaking as I finally turned on the lamp. The corner was empty. There was nothing there. No little girl, no teddy bear, and nothing that could have caused a trick of the light, like clothes draped over a chair or some other shadowy shape. This wasn't the only strange experience I've had in that house, but it's one that will stay with me forever. Despite the eerie encounters, I still love that place. It's full of history, memories, and a deep sense of home. My family still owns the farmhouse, and we make a point to visit it every year. That said, there's always a part of me that wonders if the little girl in the corner will be waiting for me again. Story 10. I woke up suddenly, without any clear reason. Sitting up in bed, I felt an unusual sense of alertness, like something had pulled me from sleep. My gaze instinctively turned toward the door. To my shock, the door creaked open ever so slightly. A figure stepped halfway into the room, paused as if surveying the space, and then quickly retreated, slamming the door shut behind it. The sharp, unmistakable sound of the door slamming echoed in the eerie stillness of the early morning. What I saw defied explanation. The figure had an otherworldly glow, reminiscent of how ghosts are often depicted in movies, but its face was what truly unnerved me. There were no discernible features, just a smooth, blank surface that sent shivers down my spine. It wore what looked like a long robe or dress, the edges faintly glowing, and it moved as though caught in an invisible breeze. I sat frozen, unable to process what I'd just seen. But there was one detail that made the encounter even more unsettling. The door had opened the wrong way against the hinges. That was impossible, and yet it happened. This experience took place in my room at the Army barracks on Fort Carson, a place I had always considered ordinary, grounded firmly in reality. I'd never experienced anything like it before, and I haven't since. I can't help but wonder, was it a hallucination brought on by stress or fatigue, or was it something more? If anyone has had a similar experience or can offer an explanation, I'd love to hear it. This moment, though subtle, turned me into a true believer in the paranormal. It lingers in my memory, leaving me with more questions than answers. Story 11. I was just 17, hanging out at my ex's parents' house. We were sitting on her bed, chatting casually, when something completely unexplainable happened. Out of nowhere, the empty hangers in her closet began moving. Not just a little wiggle, but swinging back and forth with noticeable force, as if someone had run their hand across them. It wasn't subtle. We both froze, staring at the closet in stunned silence. There was no logical explanation. No fan was on, no windows or doors were open, and the room didn't even have the faintest draft. We had a clear view into the closet, and the hangers kept swaying, as if moved by some unseen hand. We exchanged a nervous glance, a mix of uneasy laughter and genuine fear. I felt compelled to say something, so I muttered, you no harm, spirit, but I acknowledge your presence," or something along those lines. After that, the hangers gradually stilled. Nothing else happened while I was there, but the experience left a lasting impression. Later, my ex told me that strange things had happened in the house before. She mentioned doors closing on their own, which she always thought might be due to air currents or open windows. But then she shared something more unsettling. After her dad's ex-wife left the house, he began feeling an inexplicable sense of unease. A heavy, almost oppressive vibe in the home. It got so bad that, despite not being a particularly religious man, he called a priest to bless the house. This happened years before the incident with the hangers, but it had stuck with her ever since. She had a theory. The blessing might have trapped a spirit in the house, preventing it from moving on. I'm not sure what to make of that theory, but I know what I saw that day. The memory of those hangers swaying, seemingly on their own, is enough to make me believe that there are things in this world we can't easily explain. Story 12. Neither my girlfriend nor I are the type to jump to conclusions or assume the paranormal. We're both pretty grounded people, and until now, I'd never experienced anything ghostly or unexplainable. But tonight, something happened that genuinely unsettled me, and her terror was impossible to ignore. She had just left my house and was heading home. I have a long driveway, and at the end of it, there's a gate. Her automatic gate opener wasn't working, so she had to get out of her car to manually open the gate, drive through, and then close it again. It was during this routine process that everything took a chilling turn. After she closed the gate, she got back into her car and glanced in the rear-view mirror to make sure the gate was fully shut. That's when she saw it. Something or someone slouched in the trunk of her car. She described it as having a long neck and an unnatural, hunched posture. She said it reminded her of the character from Inside Out with the elongated neck and slouched, eerie demeanor. She screamed, looked away, and when she glanced back, it was gone. Completely panicked, she called me, crying and shaking in a way I'd never seen before. She begged me to come outside and check her car because she couldn't bring herself to do it. Her fear was so raw and real that it sent chills down my spine. I grabbed a flashlight and rushed out to her car. I checked everywhere, the trunk, the back seat, under the car. But there was nothing, not a single thing out of place. I tried to reassure her, but she was adamant about what she'd seen. She admitted she'd felt a bit sleepy while driving and wondered if it could have been a hallucination caused by drowsiness. But at the same time, she was so sure of what she saw that it left me questioning everything. This wasn't just a vague feeling or a fleeting shadow in the corner of her eye. She described it in enough detail to make me believe she saw something. What makes this even stranger is that I live in a pretty remote area. There aren't many people around, especially at night, so the odds of it being an actual person are slim. When I asked her to clarify what she saw, She couldn't say much about its color or finer details. She hadn't gotten a good enough look. But what stood out most to her was its posture, hunched and unnatural. Now I don't know what to think. Could it have been her dreams blending into reality due to exhaustion? Or was it something else entirely? All I know is that I've never seen her this terrified before, and the whole thing has left me feeling uneasy. What do you all think? Should I be worried? Or was this just a one-off incident?
Story 13. The urban legend I'm about to share is one that hits close to home, literally. I live just down the street from Pheasant Hill Park in Dyer, Indiana, near a school that sits next to a dense stretch of woods. These woods are a place I've always avoided at night, and for good reason. I've walked those trails countless times during the day, but there's always been an eerie, lingering sense of being watched. That unsettling feeling eventually led me to share the chilling story I'd heard about the woods, the tale of a ghostly lumberjack. The legend dates back to the early 1900s, long before the school and railroad tracks existed. At that time, the area was farmland, and a lone man lived in a secluded cabin deep within the woods. He worked as a lumberjack, chopping trees to make a living. Years later, when the railroad tracks were constructed, they ran right behind his home. According to the story, one fateful day while the man was out cutting trees, a train came roaring through and struck him, killing him instantly. His tragic death is said to have left an indelible mark on the area. By the 1960s, local kids were spreading stories of the man's ghost. They claimed that if you ventured into the woods on Halloween night, the anniversary of his death, you might encounter him. Witnesses reported strange and frightening phenomena, rustling in the trees, faint whispers, and even the sensation of being followed. 3 years ago, curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to test the legend for myself. It's an experience I'll never repeat. That night, I entered the woods with a flashlight and a mixture of nerves and excitement. Almost immediately, the oppressive sensation of being watched consumed me. The stillness of the night was punctuated by unsettling noises, branches cracking, rustling leaves, and faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught fleeting glimpses of movement, shadows darting between the trees. But every time I turned to look, nothing was there. It felt like I had stepped into a horror movie, the tension building with every passing second. The fear became overwhelming, and I eventually turned back, vowing never to return after dark. The woods had taken on a life of their own that night, and I had no desire to test the limits of whatever might dwell there. If anyone dares to explore those woods on Halloween night, or any other time after dark, I'd be curious to hear your experiences. But be warned, those woods are not for the faint of heart. Whatever remains there, whether it's the spirit of the lumberjack or something else entirely, it's not something to take lightly. Prepare yourself and tread carefully. Story 14. I was lying on the couch next to my boyfriend while he was playing a video game. I was just relaxing, scrolling through my phone, when something caught my attention from the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a spider. What else would slowly descend from the ceiling towards you? But when I shifted my focus for a better look, I realized it wasn't a spider at all. What I saw was a thin, black, worm-like thing, about the length of a finger, moving in a way that resembled how a worm wiggles. Instinctively, I started pulling back, panicking, like you do when something creepy gets too close. I tried to figure out what it was, and if it was dangerous. My boyfriend noticed my reaction and asked what was wrong. I stammered, "What the hell is that? There's something floating." Just then, the thing changed direction, slowly floating upwards as though it were weightless, like a feather caught in an invisible breeze, but there was no breeze in the room. I pointed at it, frantic, and said, "Right there. See that?" My boyfriend looked confused and replied, "Where?" I kept pointing, almost desperate. "Do you see it?" I asked, but he insisted he couldn't see anything. At that moment, I started to feel crazy. I blinked a few times, wondering if it was something in my eye, but no, this thing was real. It kept floating upward, slowly and steadily, until it reached the ceiling and simply vanished. It was like it passed right through the ceiling, like a ghost. I was left sitting there completely freaked out while my boyfriend continued to insist he hadn't seen anything. I got up, turned on the overhead light, replacing the dim, cozy one we had been using. I paced around the area where I'd seen the thing disappear, hoping to spot it again in better light. But nothing. I rushed to the bathroom to check my eyes, wondering if maybe something was wrong with them. But no. I'm familiar with eye floaters, the little specks or squiggles you sometimes see, but this was nothing like that. Eye floaters move with your gaze or vanish when you blink. This thing was external, a tangible presence. Now, I'm sitting here trying to process what just happened. My boyfriend thinks I'm stressed out. It was Thanksgiving, and we had just gotten home after visiting family. Yesterday had been a long day of cooking, but I had felt perfectly calm and content when this happened. Did I hallucinate? Was it something paranormal? I've never experienced anything like this before, and I don't know how to move on with my night after seeing something so bizarre. Has anyone ever seen anything like this before? When I was 9 years old, I went into my computer room back home. I heard a voice calling my name, twice. I thought it was my maid, so I went to look out the window. That's when I saw a face, a girl's face, covered in blood. I was terrified, and after staring at her for just a couple of seconds, she vanished. I looked out the window again, but there was nothing. After that, my family bought a new clock with a spider on it, and ever since that day, I've been afraid of spiders. I believe ghosts are real now. Maybe they're a form of energy that can only exist in quiet places. I used to think it was all fake, until I experienced it myself. Thanks for watching my video.